The security guard at the Graceland gate saw the Lincoln Continental weaving up the driveway at 2:50 in the morning, and knew immediately this was going to be a problem. The car was moving erratically, too fast then too slow, crossing the center line of the private drive, and when it screeched to a stop at the wrought iron gates, the driver who stumbled out was unmistakable even in the darkness. Jerry Lee Lewis, drunk, furious, and carrying a .38 caliber Derringer pistol. "I want to see Elvis," Jerry Lee announced, his words slurred, but his intent crystal clear. "Right now. Get him out here." It was January 1976, 3 o'clock in the morning in Memphis, Tennessee, and one of the most volatile personalities in rock and roll had just shown up at Elvis Presley's front gate, armed and demanding an audience. The guard, whose job was to keep unwanted visitors away from Graceland, was now facing a situation that no training manual could have prepared him for. How do you tell Jerry Lee Lewis, a legitimate star in his own right, someone who'd known Elvis for 20 years, that he can't see Elvis? And how do you do it when he's waving a gun around? Look at this moment. This is where everything could go catastrophically wrong. A drunk musician with a weapon and a grudge at the home of the most famous entertainer in the world. One wrong word, one wrong move, and this becomes a tragedy, instead of just a bizarre incident. Jerry Lee had driven from his home in Mississippi, making the 2-hour journey in the middle of the night, because the grievances he'd been nursing for years had finally reached a boiling point. The alcohol had dissolved whatever inhibitions were keeping those grievances contained. And the gun was Jerry Lee's way of making sure he wouldn't be dismissed or ignored. That people would take him seriously. That Elvis would have to come out and face him. The rivalry between Elvis Presley and Jerry Lee Lewis went back to the very beginning, to those early days at Sun Records in Memphis when they were both young and hungry, and convinced they were going to change the world. Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records, had recorded them both in the same studio, sometimes on the same day. There's a famous photograph from December 1956, the $1 Million Quartet session, that captures Elvis, Jerry Lee, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash all gathered around a piano at Sun Studios. They look young and excited, and full of the confidence that comes from knowing you're part of something revolutionary. Elvis had been the first breakthrough, the one who'd proven that a white kid singing in a black style could sell records and cause mass hysteria. That's All Right, in 1954. Then Heartbreak Hotel in 1956. Then everything exploded. By 1957, Elvis was the biggest star in America. Movies, records, television appearances, screaming fans everywhere he went. He'd signed with RCA for an unprecedented $40,000. He'd become more than a musician. He'd become a phenomenon. Jerry Lee had come next in the Sun Records pipeline, bringing his own brand of piano-pounding, hell-raising rock and roll that was just as revolutionary in its own way. When Whole Lotta Shakin' Going On hit in 1957, followed by Great Balls of Fire later that year, Jerry Lee became a legitimate star in his own right. His live shows were legendary. He'd play piano standing up, kick the bench away, sometimes set the piano on fire, or play with his feet. He brought an unhinged energy to performances that made even Elvis look restrained by comparison. For a brief shining moment in the late 50s, they'd been equals or close to it. Different styles, different approaches, but operating at the same level of success and cultural impact. Elvis had the movies and the broader mainstream appeal. Jerry Lee had the raw talent and the live show that could blow the roof off any venue. They'd respected each other's talent even as they competed for the same audience, the same radio play, the same spot at the top of the charts. There was rivalry, certainly, but it was the rivalry of peers who recognized each other's gifts. But then 1958 happened, and everything changed. Jerry Lee married Myra Gale Brown, who was his first cousin once removed. That alone would have raised eyebrows in 1958 America. But the real scandal was her age. She was 13 years old when they married. Jerry Lee was 22. When the British press found out during a tour, the reaction was swift and devastating. Headlines screamed about perversion and immorality. Radio stations pulled his records immediately. Tours were cancelled. Venues refused to book him. The moral outrage was absolute and unforgiving. Jerry Lee's career imploded almost overnight. He went from playing to thousands of screaming fans to playing for crowds of dozens who showed up more out of morbid curiosity than genuine appreciation. His records stopped selling. His bookings dried up. The industry that had celebrated him just months earlier now wanted nothing to do with him. He'd gone from being on top of the world to being blacklisted, and all because of who he'd chosen to marry. Elvis, meanwhile, had been drafted into the United States Army in March 1958, just as Jerry Lee's scandal was breaking. But where Jerry Lee's departure from the public eye became permanent exile, Elvis's became carefully managed absence. Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, orchestrated his army service to maintain public interest. There were photo opportunities, controlled press releases, a sense that Elvis was serving his country honorably, and when he came back in March 1960, his career was fine. Better than fine. He'd become more mature, more acceptable to mainstream audiences, less threatening to parents who'd been afraid of his sexuality and his influence on their teenagers. The 60s saw Elvis transition into movies, mostly forgettable beach films and musical comedies that made money but did nothing for his artistic credibility. But they kept him famous, kept him relevant, kept him earning. Jerry Lee spent those same years in exile, performing at smaller and smaller venues, trying to rebuild what he'd lost. He'd moved from rock and roll into country music, where the audience was more forgiving of personal scandals. He had some success there, charted some country hits, but nothing that approached the heights he'd reached before the scandal. By 1976, the gap between their lives had become a chasm. Elvis was living at Graceland, the colonial revival mansion he'd purchased in 1957 for $102,500, a fortune at the time. The estate sat on 13.8 acres in Memphis, surrounded by walls and gates that kept the world at a distance. Inside those walls, Elvis lived with his entourage, the group of friends and employees known as the Memphis Mafia, who handled everything from his schedule to his personal needs. He had wealth beyond measure, fame that had sustained for 2 decades, and a place in American culture that seemed permanent regardless of how his current records were selling. Jerry Lee was living in Mississippi, in a house that was nice but nowhere near the scale of Graceland. He was still performing regularly. The country music circuit had been kinder to him than rock and roll had been after the scandal, but he was grinding it out at state fairs, smaller venues, places where the money was decent, but the glory was limited. He'd had some success, a few hit records in the country charts, enough to make a living, enough to maintain a career, but nothing that approached what he'd had in 1957, and certainly nothing that approached what Elvis had. The resentment had been building for years, probably. Every time Jerry Lee saw an Elvis movie on television, or heard an Elvis song on the radio, every time he played a small venue while Elvis sold out arenas, every time someone reminded him that he and Elvis had started from the same place, recorded in the same studio, been part of the same revolution, but had ended up in completely different positions. It wasn't jealousy exactly. Jerry Lee had his pride, had his own sense of his talent and worth, but it was something close to jealousy, a sense that the universe had been unfair in how it had distributed success between 2 men with similar gifts. On the night of January 1976, the exact date was never made completely clear in the police reports, but it was early in the month. Jerry Lee had been drinking heavily, not unusual for him. Alcohol had been a constant companion for years, but on this particular night, the drinking had taken him to a dark place mentally. Maybe he'd had a fight with someone. Maybe he'd had a bad show that reminded him of what he'd lost. Maybe it was just that the accumulation of years of grinding out a career, while watching someone else coast, finally became too much to bear in silence. He'd decided, somewhere in the haze of alcohol and anger, that he needed to confront Elvis, needed to have it out with him, needed Elvis to acknowledge something. What exactly Jerry Lee probably couldn't have articulated clearly, even to himself. Acknowledge that Jerry Lee was talented. Acknowledge that the disparity in their careers was unfair. Acknowledge that Jerry Lee existed, and mattered, and wasn't just a cautionary tale about what happens when you make the wrong personal choices. The .38 Derringer wasn't Jerry Lee's only gun. He owned several, as many people in the South did, but the Derringer was small, concealable, easy to carry. He'd grabbed it before leaving his house, and whether he intended to use it or just wanted it for courage or security, nobody knows. Jerry Lee himself probably didn't know. Drunk decision-making doesn't follow clear logic. Notice how the first loop opens here. Can this confrontation be resolved without violence? Can you de-escalate a drunk armed man who feels he's been wronged and is demanding satisfaction? The security guard at the gate, Harold Lloyd was his name, kept his voice calm and professional, despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Mr. Lewis, it's 3 in the morning. Elvis is asleep. I can't wake him up right now. Why don't you come back tomorrow when— I don't want to come back tomorrow, Jerry Lee interrupted, his voice rising. I want to see him now. You go in there and you tell Elvis that Jerry Lee Lewis is at his gate, and he needs to come out here and talk to me like a man. Harold could see the pistol in Jerry Lee's hand, small but deadly at close range. Jerry Lee wasn't exactly pointing it at anyone, but he wasn't putting it away either. He was holding it loosely at his side, a constant reminder that this situation could turn dangerous at any moment. Mr. Lewis, you need to put the gun away, Harold said, trying to sound authoritative without being confrontational. You can't be here with a weapon. If you want to see Elvis, we can arrange that, but you need to put the gun in your car and— I'm not putting anything away until Elvis comes out here, Jerry Lee said. His speech was slurred, but his resolve was clear. He'd driven 2 hours in the middle of the night for this confrontation, and he wasn't leaving without it. Inside Graceland, someone had already called the main house to alert them about the situation. Elvis was indeed asleep. He kept odd hours, often sleeping during the day and staying up most of the night, but even his unusual schedule had him asleep at 3 a.m. His security chief was woken up and given the news. Jerry Lee Lewis is at the gate with a gun. The decision was made quickly. Don't wake Elvis. Handle this without involving him. Call the Memphis Police Department and let them deal with it. Elvis had enough problems without adding a 3 a.m. confrontation with a drunk, armed Jerry Lee Lewis to the list. Wait. Feel what's happening from both sides of this gate. On one side, Harold is trying to do his job and keep everyone safe while dealing with an unpredictable armed man. On the other side, Jerry Lee is drunk and convinced he's owed something. Respect, acknowledgement, an explanation for why his career went one way while Elvis's went another. Both sides think they're in the right. Both sides are operating under stress and adrenaline. The police were called at 2:55 a.m. The dispatcher took the call seriously. This wasn't just any drunk with a gun situation. This was Jerry Lee Lewis, a celebrity at Graceland, Elvis Presley's home. 2 patrol cars were dispatched immediately. Jerry Lee, waiting at the gate, wasn't getting calmer. If anything, the longer he waited, the angrier he became. He started pacing, gesturing with the gun still in his hand, ranting about disrespect and betrayal, and how Elvis wouldn't have made it without the groundwork Jerry Lee and other Sun Records artists had laid. You tell him, Jerry Lee said to Harold, stabbing a finger in his direction. You tell Elvis that I'm the one who should be living in this mansion. I'm the one who can play piano and sing at the same time. What can he do? He just stands there and wiggles. I'm the real musician here. This was the alcohol talking, amplifying grievances that probably lived quieter in Jerry Lee's head most of the time. But drunk, at 3 a.m., with a gun for courage and years of resentment to fuel him, those grievances had become the only reality that mattered. The second loop opens. How will the police handle this? Can they defuse the situation without anyone getting hurt? What happens when authority arrives to deal with someone who doesn't want to be told no? The patrol cars arrived at 3:07 a.m., pulling up behind Jerry Lee's Lincoln. The officers got out carefully, hands near their weapons but not drawn yet. They could see the gun in Jerry Lee's hand, could see his agitated state, could smell the alcohol from 10 feet away. Mr. Lewis, one of the officers said, his tone professional but firm. I'm Officer Smith with the Memphis Police Department. I need you to put the gun down and step away from the gate. Jerry Lee turned to face them, and for a moment the situation hung in perfect balance. He could comply and end this peacefully, or he could escalate and turn this into something much worse. The officers tensed, ready to react if he made any threatening moves. I just want to see Elvis, Jerry Lee said, and his voice had shifted from anger to something closer to desperation. Why won't he come out? I drove all the way from Mississippi. I just want to talk to him. You can talk to him, Officer Smith said, but not at 3 in the morning with a gun. Put the weapon down and we can sort this out. The thing about drunk people with grievances is that logic doesn't always work. Jerry Lee had convinced himself that he was in the right here, that he was owed this confrontation, that Elvis was disrespecting him by not coming out. The police telling him to put down the gun and leave wasn't registering as reasonable authority. It was registering as one more group of people telling him no. One more barrier between him and the satisfaction he'd driven 2 hours to get. You'll work for Elvis? Jerry Lee asked, suspicious. Is that what this is? Elvis called you to keep me out. We work for the city of Memphis, Officer Smith said. And right now we need you to put down the weapon before this gets worse. Notice how the third loop opens here. The personal crisis. What drives someone to this point? What combination of alcohol, resentment, and diminished career prospects brings a man to his rival's gate at 3 a.m. with a gun? Jerry Lee looked at the gun in his hand, like he was surprised to see it there. For a moment the alcoholic fog seemed to clear slightly, and he appeared to realize how this looked, how this was going to end. He wasn't getting into Graceland tonight, wasn't getting his confrontation with Elvis, was probably going to jail instead. "I just wanted to talk," he said quietly. "That's all. Just talk. Then put the gun down and we can talk," Officer Smith said. Jerry Lee looked at Graceland's gates, at the mansion barely visible beyond them, at the world Elvis had built that Jerry Lee felt should have been his too. Then he looked at the gun in his hand, at the police officers watching him carefully, at Harold the security guard who'd never budged from his position. He set the gun down on the hood of his Lincoln Continental, raised his hands slightly. "All right," he said. "All right." The tension broke immediately. Officers moved in quickly, securing the weapon, patting Jerry Lee down for additional weapons, checking to make sure he wasn't going to change his mind and become violent. He didn't resist. The fight seemed to have gone out of him completely once he'd put the gun down. They arrested him for public intoxication and carrying a weapon while intoxicated. Read him his rights while he stood there swaying slightly, no longer arguing, just deflated. The whole confrontation had lasted maybe 15 minutes from when he'd arrived at the gate to when the handcuffs went on. 15 minutes that could have gone so much worse in so many ways. The police report from that night still exists in Memphis Police Department archives. It's brief and professional, noting the time of the call 2:55 a.m., the location Graceland Gates, 3764 Elvis Presley Boulevard, the suspect's name and condition Jerry Lee Lewis, intoxicated, the weapon recovered .38 caliber Derringer, loaded, and the charges filed public intoxication, carrying a weapon while intoxicated. What the report doesn't capture is the surreal nature of the situation. Two rock and roll legends connected by a confrontation that never actually happened, separated by wrought iron gates, and 2 decades of diverging fortunes. Harold Lloyd, the security guard, watched them put Jerry Lee in the back of the patrol car, watched them confiscate the gun and bag it as evidence, watched them secure Jerry Lee's Lincoln Continental and arrange for it to be towed rather than left blocking Graceland's driveway, watched the whole circus drive away from Graceland's gates, red and blue lights disappearing down Elvis Presley Boulevard, leaving just the quiet Memphis night behind. Harold would later say in interviews that Jerry Lee hadn't seemed dangerous so much as desperate, hadn't been threatening violence so much as demanding acknowledgement. The gun had been a prop more than a weapon, a way to ensure he'd be taken seriously rather than dismissed. Harold had been scared. You don't stop being scared just because someone seems more sad than violent when they're holding a gun. But looking back, he could see that Jerry Lee had been spiraling, reaching out in the only way his drunk brain could conceive, trying to force a confrontation that might give him some kind of resolution or closure, or explanation for why things had turned out the way they had. Inside the mansion, Elvis slept through the entire thing. His security chief had been woken up and informed about the situation, but they'd made the decision not to wake Elvis. He kept such irregular hours anyway, often sleeping during the day and staying up most of the night, and there was no point in disturbing him for a crisis that was already being handled. Let him sleep. Let him have a few more hours of peace before he had to deal with the knowledge that Jerry Lee Lewis had shown up drunk and armed in the middle of the night, demanding to see him. When Elvis did find out the next morning, his reaction was complicated and not entirely clear from the historical record. People who were there that day reported that he was quiet about it, thoughtful. He asked questions about what had happened, about how Jerry Lee had seemed, about whether anyone had been hurt or threatened, but he didn't fly into a rage. Didn't call Jerry Lee to yell at him, didn't call his lawyers to discuss legal action. He just absorbed the information and thought about it. Part of him was angry, certainly. Angry that Jerry Lee would do something so reckless and dangerous, would bring a weapon to Elvis's home, where his daughter Lisa Marie sometimes visited, would put the security staff in a position where they had to deal with an armed drunk at 3 a.m. That was selfish and thoughtless, and potentially catastrophic. But part of him, the part that remembered being young and hungry and fighting for recognition in the same Sun Records studio where Jerry Lee had fought, understood something about the desperation that drove someone to that gate. Elvis knew what it was like to feel like the world didn't appreciate your talent. He'd felt that way during the movie years when critics dismissed him as a sellout. He'd felt that way when the Beatles and the British invasion had made him seem old-fashioned. He'd felt that way during the 8 years between his last concert in 1961 and the Vegas comeback in 1969. He knew what desperation felt like, even if his version had never involved showing up at someone's house with a gun. He didn't press charges, didn't make a statement to the press, didn't do anything to make the situation worse for Jerry Lee than it already was. The police had arrested him on public charges. Elvis wasn't the complainant, so Elvis didn't need to pursue anything. He just let it go. Let Jerry Lee deal with the legal consequences of his own actions without adding to them. Jerry Lee was released on bond the next day. He went back to Mississippi, and his life and his career. He never apologized publicly for the incident. Never really acknowledged it, except in the vaguest terms. Elvis never talked about it publicly either. It became one of those stories that people in Memphis knew about, that got told and retold, that took on legendary proportions over the years. The second loop closes. The police handled it professionally, de-escalated when possible, and took Jerry Lee into custody without violence when he finally complied. Authority worked the way it was supposed to work, patiently, carefully, with the goal of everyone getting through alive. The incident revealed something important about both men, about Elvis, who could have made Jerry Lee's life much harder by pressing charges or talking to the press, but chose not to, who understood on some level that fame and success and the vagaries of public opinion can do terrible things to people who started out in the same place, who had enough security and distance from his own problems to extend some grace to someone who clearly didn't have their life together. And about Jerry Lee, who reached a point of such desperation and resentment that showing up armed at a rival's house at 3 a.m. seemed like a reasonable course of action, who let alcohol and grievance drive him to criminal behavior, who couldn't let go of the fact that he and Elvis had started from similar places but ended up in very different ones. The third loop closes. The personal crisis that drove Jerry Lee to Graceland that night was about more than just Elvis. It was about everything Jerry Lee had lost or never achieved, the scandal that had destroyed his career, the years of climbing back while watching Elvis coast, the feeling that talent should have been enough but hadn't been. Elvis was just the symbol, the most visible representation of success that Jerry Lee felt should have been his. In the end, nobody got hurt. That's what mattered. Nobody got shot. Nobody got killed. A situation that could have easily become a tragedy became just another strange story in the long history of rock and roll excess and rivalry. Jerry Lee got arrested, paid his fine, and went on with his life. Elvis stayed safely inside Graceland, insulated from the chaos happening at his own gate. But the incident exposed something raw about the cost of fame and failure, about what it does to people to watch others succeed while you struggle, about how alcohol and resentment and a gun at 3 a.m. can seem like the solution to problems that don't actually have solutions, about how the distance between success and failure in the music business can feel like the distance between Graceland and a gate you're not allowed to pass through. The takeaway: success and failure in any field aren't just about talent. They're about timing, luck, choices, and how the public decides to respond to mistakes. Jerry Lee Lewis and Elvis Presley started from similar places, working-class Southern kids recording at the same studio, bringing similar energy to rock and roll, changing music in their own ways. But their trajectories diverged dramatically after 1958, and that divergence had nothing to do with who was more talented. Jerry Lee made a choice, marrying his 13-year-old cousin that the public couldn't forgive. Elvis made it through his potential career-killing moment, getting drafted and